December 24th, 1945. Somewhere in the rubble-strewn streets of Frankfurt am Main. The winter air carries the smell of wet ash and broken mortar. Snow falls softly on skeletal buildings, their facades torn away like open wounds, exposing staircases that lead nowhere, and wallpaper faded by rain and ruin. In a makeshift square where a department store once stood, a group of American soldiers huddle around a fuel drum fire, their breath forming small clouds in the frozen dusk. One of them, a private from Ohio barely 20 years old, pulls a small foil-wrapped bar from his jacket pocket. It's chocolate, Hershey's standard issue, carried across an ocean and a continent. He breaks it in half and offers a piece to a German girl, perhaps 12, hollow-eyed and silent, who stands at the edge of the firelight, clutching her younger brother's hand. She takes it, and then, without warning, she begins to weep. It is not the weeping of pain, though pain surrounds her. It is not the weeping of fear, though fear has been her companion for years. It is something else entirely, something the soldier will spend the rest of his life trying to understand. In that moment, in that gesture of a broken chocolate bar, something shifts in the wreckage of post-war Germany. Not politics, not treaties, but something quieter, more profound. A recognition, perhaps, of what had been lost, and what had been found again in the simplest of human exchanges. This is not a story of heroes. It is not a story of villains. It is a story of chocolate. To understand the tears of a German child in the winter of 1945, we must first understand what chocolate meant in the context of total war. For Americans, chocolate was ordinary, a comfort item, a sweet distraction, something found in every drugstore and five and dime. The United States War Department contracted with Hershey's to produce the legendary D-ration, a 4-ounce bar designed to sustain a soldier with 600 calories of quick energy. It was deliberately made to taste just good enough to eat, but not so good that soldiers would consume it wastefully. Between 1940 and 1945, American factories produced over 3 billion of these bars. 3 billion! The number itself is staggering, a testament to industrial capacity so vast it could afford to package hope in foil wrappers and distribute it across every theater of war. For Germans, especially in the final years of the war, chocolate was a memory. The Allied blockade, the diversion of all agricultural production toward the war machine, and the systematic requisitioning of even the most basic foodstuffs had reduced the German diet to potatoes, turnips, and ersatz bread made from sawdust and ground acorns. Children born in 1940 had never tasted real chocolate. Older children remembered it the way one remembers a dream, something sweet and distant and impossibly remote from the gray reality of ration cards and empty cupboards. The Nazi regime had promised strength through scarcity, victory through sacrifice. They had promised that suffering today would yield a 1,000-year empire tomorrow. And now tomorrow had arrived, and it tasted like ash. When American forces crossed the Rhine in March of 1945, they brought with them an abundance that defied German comprehension. Soldiers carried not just weapons, but cigarettes, chewing gum, canned fruit, white bread, coffee, and yes, chocolate. Mountains of chocolate. Warehouses in liberated towns were stocked with supplies that seemed to multiply overnight. For the Americans, this was logistics. For the Germans, it was revelation. Here was an enemy who had fought across an ocean, who had landed on hostile shores, who had clawed their way through hedgerows and winter forests, and yet still had enough surplus to give away sweets to children. The contrast could not have been sharper. The Wehrmacht had retreated eastward on empty stomachs, burning their own villages for warmth, requisitioning the last loaves of bread from their own people, and the Americans arrived with chocolates in their pockets. But the real story begins not in 1945, but earlier, in the years when German soldiers and civilians still believed in victory, still trusted the promises of their leaders. still imagined that their sacrifices would be rewarded. Before we meet the girl who wept over chocolate, we must meet the ideology that taught her to despise the very people who would one day offer her kindness. Nazi propaganda had spent over a decade preparing the German people for total war. From the earliest days of Hitler's rise to power, the regime cultivated an image of Americans as weak, decadent, racially corrupted, and hopelessly addicted to comfort. American cinema, American jazz, American consumerism, all of it was held up as evidence of a civilization in decline, a mongrel nation without discipline or purpose. The German people were told they were warriors, ascetics, disciplined in body and pure in spirit. Americans, by contrast, were soft, obsessed with luxuries, incapable of the sacrifices necessary for greatness. When war came, this narrative intensified. Goebbels's propaganda machine churned out images of American soldiers as cowards who relied on machines because they lacked the martial virtue of true soldiers. They were portrayed as gangsters in uniform, more interested in looting than fighting, representatives of a crass culture built on materialism and greed. German soldiers absorbed these messages. Letters from the Eastern Front reveal a grim pride in suffering, a belief that hardship was proof of ideological superiority. They ate frozen bread and called it strength. They marched through Russian winters without proper boots and called it resilience. And when they heard stories of American soldiers complaining about cold rations or demanding hot coffee, they laughed. Those Americans, they thought, would never survive what we have survived. But then, the Americans arrived. The first encounters were bewildering. At Normandy, German defenders watched in disbelief as American forces unloaded supplies on the beaches. Not just ammunition, but vast quantities of food, medical supplies, vehicles, even construction equipment. The Americans didn't just invade, they brought their entire industrial base with them. They built harbors out of nothing. They laid roads. They established field hospitals that looked like small cities. And everywhere, always, there was food. K-Rations, C-Rations, D-Rations. The Americans ate better in foxholes than many German civilians ate at home. One captured Wehrmacht officer, interrogated in Normandy in June of 1944, reportedly said, "We were told you were decadent, but you fight with full bellies. We fight with empty ones. Who is truly weaker?" The question haunted him. It haunted many, because implicit in that question was a larger doubt. If the Americans could afford to be so abundant, so wasteful even, in the midst of war, what did that say about the economic system that supported them? What did it say about democracy, about capitalism, about all the ideologies the Nazi regime had taught Germans to despise? The chocolate, then, was not just chocolate. It was evidence. Evidence of a system that worked. Evidence of a nation that could wage war on multiple continents and still have surplus. Evidence that maybe, just maybe, the promises made by the Führer were lies. By the winter of 1944, the illusion was collapsing. Germany was being crushed between two massive offensives, the Soviets advancing from the east, the Western Allies from the west. Cities burned under bombing raids that came every night, turning urban centers into moonscapes of rubble and ruin. The ration system, already strained, began to fail entirely. Bread disappeared. Meat became a distant memory. Mothers boiled nettles to make soup. Children chewed on leather scraps to stave off hunger. And all the while, the propaganda continued. Hold on. Victory is near. Sacrifice today for triumph tomorrow. But the soldiers returning from the front told different stories. They spoke of American supply convoys that stretched for miles, of field kitchens that served hot meals twice a day, of medical tents stocked with morphine and plasma and antibiotics. They spoke of American soldiers who smoked cigarettes as if tobacco grew on trees, who discarded half-eaten rations, who seemed genuinely confused when German prisoners stared at their food in astonishment. One German POW, captured in the Battle of the Bulge, later wrote in his memoir, "They gave us coffee, Real coffee, not ersatz, and white bread with butter. I thought I was hallucinating. I thought it was a trick. But it was real. They had so much they could afford to feed their enemies. This abundance was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate American policy. The U.S. military understood that morale was tied to logistics, that soldiers fought better when they were well-fed and well-supplied. But more than that, American abundance was ideological. It was a demonstration of democratic capitalism's productive capacity, a rebuttal to fascist austerity and communist scarcity. When American soldiers handed out chocolate and cigarettes to liberated populations, they were not just being generous. They were ambassadors of a different way of life, a system that produced surplus rather than demanding sacrifice. And the Germans noticed Christmas of 1945 was the first peacetime Christmas in 6 years. The war in Europe had ended in May. Hitler was dead. The Reich had collapsed. But peace brought little relief. Germany was occupied, divided, devastated. 17 million Germans were homeless. The currency was worthless. The black market ruled. In cities like Berlin, Hamburg, and Frankfurt, people lived in cellars and bombed-out buildings, scavenging for firewood, trading family heirlooms for potatoes. The winter of 1945 was one of the coldest on record, and fuel was almost impossible to find. People froze to death in their sleep. Children died of malnutrition. The phrase Stunde Null, 0 hour, captured the prevailing sense that everything had been destroyed, that Germany was starting from nothing. In this context, American occupation forces faced a dilemma. The official policy, outlined in Joint Chiefs of Staff Directive JCS 1067, was strict. Germany was to be treated as a defeated enemy, not a liberated friend. Fraternization was forbidden. Aid was to be minimal. The German people were to feel the consequences of the war they had supported. But reality, as always, was more complicated. American soldiers, most of them young men from small towns and cities across the United States, found it difficult to maintain hostility toward starving children and exhausted civilians. They saw the ruins. They saw the hunger. And many of them, against orders, began to share what they had. Chocolate became the currency of compassion. It was portable, non-perishable, and universally desired. A single Hershey bar could buy almost anything on the black market, but more often, soldiers simply gave it away. To children playing in the rubble, to old women sweeping broken glass from doorsteps, to families huddled in makeshift shelters. The phrase, "Got any gum, chum?" became a common refrain among German children, who quickly learned that American soldiers were soft touches, likely to empty their pockets if asked politely. But the tears, those came from something deeper than gratitude for a sweet treat. They came from the collision of expectation and reality, from the sudden, overwhelming recognition of what had been lost and what could have been. For years, German children had been taught to hate Americans, to see them as enemies of the Volk, destroyers of culture, representatives of a degenerate civilization. And now here they were, these supposed barbarians, offering kindness in the form of chocolate. The cognitive dissonance was shattering. If the Americans were not monsters, then what did that make the regime that had portrayed them as such? If the enemy was capable of generosity, what did that say about the leaders who had demanded total hatred? The girl in Frankfurt, the one who wept when given chocolate, was not unique. Reports from occupation forces across Germany describe similar scenes. Children breaking down in tears when offered food, women sobbing when handed soap or canned milk, old men weeping at the sight of white bread. These were not tears of simple gratitude. They were tears of grief for the lies they had believed, for the years they had wasted, for the future that had been stolen from them in the name of a glorious past that never existed. One American chaplain, stationed in Munich in the winter of 1945, kept a detailed journal of his experiences. He wrote about a Christmas Eve service he held in a ruined church, attended by both American soldiers and German civilians. After the service, he distributed small care packages, each containing a chocolate bar, a pack of cigarettes, a small tin of meat, and a handkerchief. He wrote, "I have never seen such weeping. Not from joy, exactly, but from something more complicated. Relief, perhaps, or shame, or the sudden realization that the world is not as they were told." One old man held the chocolate bar and said to me in broken English, "We were told you would kill us. You give us this instead. I do not understand." I did not know how to answer him. The chaplain's confusion is understandable. For Americans, charity was natural, almost reflexive. The United States had emerged from the war richer and more powerful than ever before. Its cities were intact. Its industrial base had expanded. Its people had sacrificed, yes, but nothing compared to the devastation experienced by Europe and Asia. Sharing surplus was easy when you had so much. But for Germans, this generosity was incomprehensible within the framework they had been given. Enemies were supposed to be cruel. Victors were supposed to take revenge. The Red Army, advancing from the east, had confirmed this expectation with systematic brutality. But the Americans were different. They brought chocolate. This difference mattered. In the years following the war, as Germany began the long process of reconstruction, the memory of American generosity played a significant role in shaping public opinion. The Marshall Plan, announced in 1947, provided billions of dollars in aid to rebuild European economies, including Germany. But before the Marshall Plan, before the official policies of Reconstruction, there was chocolate. There were soldiers who bent the rules to share their rations. There were officers who looked the other way when their men fraternized with German civilians. There was a grassroots diplomacy of small kindnesses that laid the groundwork for reconciliation. The chocolate was a symbol, yes, but it was also a practical tool. It demonstrated that the American system worked, that democracy and capitalism could produce not just weapons, but abundance, not just power, but generosity. It was a form of soft power before the term was invented, a way of winning hearts and minds through the simple act of sharing. But we must not romanticize this too much. The occupation was not uniformly benevolent. There were American soldiers who committed crimes, who exploited the desperation of German women, who treated civilians with contempt. There were policies, such as the initial prohibition on aid and the slow pace of denazification, that caused immense suffering. And there was the reality that American generosity was selective, shaped by Cold War calculations and strategic interests. The chocolate flowed more freely in the western zones than in the east, where Soviet occupation brought a different kind of deprivation. The symbol of American abundance was also a symbol of division, a marker of the Iron Curtain that was already descending across Europe. Yet for individual Germans, especially children, the experience of receiving chocolate from an American soldier was transformative. It taught them that enemies could become friends, that ideology was not destiny, that the world was more complicated than propaganda had suggested. Many of the children who wept over chocolate in 1945 grew up to be leaders of post-war Germany, architects of the economic miracle, defenders of democracy. They carried with them the memory of that moment when a foreign soldier, who had every reason to hate them, chose kindness instead. One of those children, a woman named Ingrid, later recounted her experience in an oral history project. She was 11 years old in December 1945, living with her mother and two younger siblings in a basement in Nuremberg. Her father had died on the Eastern Front. They had nothing. No food, no heat, no hope. On Christmas Eve, an American patrol stopped near their shelter. One of the soldiers, she remembered, had red hair and freckles. He looked impossibly young. He pulled out a chocolate bar, broke it into pieces, and handed one to each of them. Ingrid's mother tried to refuse, tried to maintain some dignity in the face of charity. But the soldier insisted. He smiled and said something in English they didn't understand, and then he left. Ingrid wrote, "I put the chocolate in my mouth, and it melted. I had forgotten that anything could taste so sweet. And then I cried. I cried because I was ashamed. Ashamed that I had been taught to hate these people. Ashamed that I had believed the lies. ashamed that it took a piece of chocolate to make me see the truth. That truth was painful. It meant accepting that the war had been lost not just militarily, but morally, that the sacrifices had been for nothing, that the vision of a 1,000-year Reich had been a delusion. But it also meant accepting that the future did not have to be defined by the past, that redemption was possible, that even in the ruins of total defeat, human connection could still exist. The chocolate bar became a recurring motif in post-war German literature and film. It appeared in novels, in memoirs, in songs. It symbolized the moment of awakening, the transition from Nazi ideology to democratic values. It was the taste of freedom, the sweetness of peace, the bittersweet recognition of complicity and loss. In one famous German film from the 1950s, a character says, "I learned more about America from a chocolate bar than from all the propaganda we were fed." The line resonated because it captured a widespread experience, the realization that material abundance was not a sign of decadence but of a functioning system, that generosity was not weakness but strength. This realization was particularly significant for German women, who bore much of the burden of post-war survival. With millions of men dead or imprisoned, women became the primary breadwinners, the scavengers, the negotiators with occupation forces. They were the ones who stood in line for rations, who traded on the black market, who rebuilt homes from rubble, and they were the ones who often interacted most directly with American soldiers. These interactions were fraught and complex, sometimes exploitative, sometimes transactional, but also sometimes genuinely humane. A chocolate bar could mean the difference between a child eating or going hungry. It could be a gesture of respect, an acknowledgement of shared humanity, a bridge across the chasm of war. One account from a displaced persons camp near Frankfurt describes a Christmas party organized by American soldiers for German orphans. The soldiers brought gifts, candy, toys, clothing, and, of course, chocolate. Many of the orphans had lost their entire families in the war. They had lived through bombings, starvation, and trauma. When the chocolate was distributed, several children simply stared at it, unable to process what they were seeing. One boy, perhaps 8 years old, asked if it was real. When told yes, he burst into tears. A soldier knelt beside him and held him while he sobbed. No words were exchanged. They didn't speak the same language, but the gesture spoke volumes. This scene was repeated countless times across occupied Germany in that first post-war winter. Christmas, a holiday traditionally centered on family, abundance, and peace, became a moment of reckoning. The contrast between the nightmare of the war years and the tentative hope of peace was overwhelming. And chocolate, trivial as it might seem, became the medium through which that contrast was experienced and understood. In February 1946, the policy of non-fraternization was officially relaxed. American soldiers were allowed to interact freely with German civilians, to date German women, to form friendships. The change reflected a broader shift in American policy, from punishment to reconstruction, from isolation to integration. But even before the official change, the barriers had been breaking down, one chocolate bar at a time. The German response to American generosity was complicated. There was gratitude, certainly, but also resentment. Some Germans felt humiliated by their dependence on the victors, embarrassed by their children's eagerness to beg for sweets. There was a sense that accepting charity was an admission of total defeat, a surrender not just militarily, but morally. In some households, parents forbade their children from accepting gifts from American soldiers, insisting on maintaining pride even in destitution. But hunger is a powerful force, and pride is a luxury few could afford in the winter of 1945. Over time, the chocolate became normalized. What had once been extraordinary became routine. Children no longer wept when given sweets. They expected them. The black market value of chocolate stabilized. The novelty wore off, but the memory remained, especially for those who experienced it in that first overwhelming moment. The memory of a time when chocolate was not just food, but revelation. From a military perspective, the distribution of chocolate and other supplies to German civilians was a strategic masterstroke. Even if it was often spontaneous and unauthorized, it demonstrated American power in a non-threatening way, built goodwill, and helped stabilize occupied territories. It also served as a contrast to Soviet occupation policies in the East, where requisitioning and violence were common. The chocolate became part of the Cold War propaganda battle before the Cold War had even officially begun. But to reduce the chocolate to mere strategy is to miss its deeper significance. The American soldiers who shared their rations were not following orders or executing policy. They were acting on instinct, on compassion, on the simple human impulse to help those in need. Many of them were disturbed by what they saw in Germany: the destruction, the hunger, the desperation. They had been prepared to fight enemies, not to occupy a shattered nation full of starving children. The cognitive dissonance was as difficult for them as it was for the Germans, and so they gave what they could, not because they were told to, but because it felt right. This distinction matters. The chocolate was effective not because it was strategic, but because it was genuine. Germans could sense the difference between official aid and personal kindness. The former was accepted with suspicion, the latter with tears. By 1947, the worst of the hunger crisis had passed. The Marshall Plan was underway. The Deutschmark was introduced, stabilizing the currency. The black market began to recede. Slowly, painfully, Germany began to rebuild. But the memory of that first post-war winter lingered. It shaped how Germans viewed Americans, how they understood democracy, how they imagined their own future. In later decades, as Germany transformed into a prosperous democratic nation, the story of the chocolate became a kind of founding myth of the post-war era. It represented the moment when Germany turned away from fascism and toward the West, when hunger was replaced by abundance, when enemies became allies. It was a story of redemption, of second chances, of the power of small gestures to change the course of history. And the girl who wept? She grew up. She married. She raised children in a country that bore little resemblance to the nightmare of her youth. She told her children about the chocolate, about the American soldier who gave it to her, about the way the world can change in a single moment of unexpected kindness. She told them so they would understand that history is not just about great battles and famous leaders, but about small human moments that ripple outward in ways we cannot predict. There is a photograph, famous in Germany, taken in Frankfurt in December 1945. It shows an American soldier kneeling in the snow, handing a chocolate bar to a German girl. Her face is turned away from the camera, but her posture, shoulders hunched, hands clutching the foil wrapper, speaks of something profound. Behind them, the ruins of the city stretch into the distance, a landscape of shattered stone and broken dreams. The photograph is black and white, grainy, imperfect, but it has become an icon, a symbol of reconciliation, of the moment when Germany began to heal. What the photograph does not show is the soldier's face. We do not know his name. We do not know if he survived the war, if he returned home, if he ever thought about that girl again. But it does not matter. He was one of thousands, one of millions, who carried chocolate across an ocean and gave it away without expecting anything in return. He was a representative of a system that valued abundance over scarcity, generosity over cruelty, hope over despair. And the girl? She carried that chocolate with her for the rest of her life. Not in her pocket, but in her memory. It became part of who she was, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, kindness is possible. That even between enemies, humanity can survive. That a piece of chocolate, shared in the snow, can mean more than all the speeches and treaties in the world. This is the truth that the tears revealed. That ideology crumbles in the face of lived experience. That propaganda cannot withstand the evidence of generosity. that the sweetness of chocolate can teach what 1,000 books cannot. The Germans expected cruelty from their conquerors. They received chocolate instead. And in that reversal, in that unexpected gift, the future was born. The ruins were rebuilt. The wounds healed, slowly. The children who wept over chocolate grew into adults who built a new Germany, democratic and free. But they never forgot. How could they? Taste is memory, and the memory of sweetness, after so much bitterness, lasts forever.